It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to share with you some information about the FLO de-stressing technology. I've been fortunate to have spent my entire life actually on the leading edge of science and technology, having grown up in a family where my father was quite a brilliant scientist, and we had labs in our basement from the time I was a child. And throughout my career, I have circulated at among leading-edge scientists around the world, and been involved really with technology, as I say, all my life, having created a company at one time in the past that created some 3,500 patents in its field, and licensed and joint ventured what became approximately $400 million worth of transactions in the licensing and commercialization of technologies. So it's been quite a journey, and one of the things which I've come to experience over the years is to appreciate the widening gap between what's known today on the leading edge of science and technology and what's known by the public, unfortunately, about what's known in science and technology. That is, that gap has never been as wide in my lifetime as it is right now. And many of us at the leading edge of science and technology have come to understand the basis of quite a different paradigm, a very, very different paradigm than what's widely known and widely taught. And many of us have mused over the question of how do you fix this problem when mainstream science is still teaching a paradigm that turns out to be quite flawed, and every educational institution on the face of the earth is still teaching a great deal of science that turns out to be incorrect relative to what we now know at the leading edge of science and technology. And some of us concluded that the way that you fix that is not by trying to change the mainstream scientific view, which in the lamenting words of Max Planck, the famous physicist, that group changes, quote, one funeral at a time, unquote. But you change it by introducing technologies into the society that are based on the different understanding, in this case quite a different paradigm than is widely taught. And by its adoption, it becomes common knowledge in the society that in fact there is a different paradigm. And the mainstream scientific community is usually actually the last to come along and finally admit that in fact the emperor has no clothes. So anyway, some of us who had come to independently understand the same paradigm got together and formed a technology company. Yet again, I've formed many of them in my lifetime. Never thought I would actually be forming another one in this time. But we formed a technology company in order to create technologies that were based in the paradigm that we'd all come to understand independently, and all of which were impossible or would be impossible by the classical view and are not, and to introduce those technologies as a means of actually bringing education into the public about the existence of a different paradigm. FLO de-stressing technology is exactly such a product of four of us who formed a technology company a year ago, January, combined our knowledge and created a de-stressing technology which was based in a different paradigm. It's what we call a paradigm buster. And it also was created really for the purpose of training wheels. Having spent all of my career up until about 7 years ago developing material technologies, that is physical technologies, which went into the electronics industry, the aerospace and defense industry, automotive industry, the steel industry, and many, many other industries. I actually came to a point in my career where I decided that I really wasn't learning very fast anymore by continuing to do that, and it was becoming more difficult to do for reasons that I won't elaborate on currently, but based upon some megatrends that were occurring in the world. And my shift in my interest, moved toward understanding the relationship between consciousness and so-called physical reality, which is consciousness has always been very close to my heart, having been a very prolific inventor. My father was, our son is, and all of us knew that the way that we were inventing was basically receiving technology rather than using rational thought processes. We used our scientific backgrounds to interpret what it was we were receiving, but we knew that the way that these things were being created, as does any composer, any artist, etc., was by a receiving process. And the last 7 years have been the most amazing journey of my life. Seeing a lot of phenomena that are based in the study and understanding of consciousness and, as I say, its relationship to so-called physical reality. And I came to realize that by far the most amazing technology is what lives within us all. It's quite phenomenal. We all have abilities that are absolutely phenomenal as compared with what most of us are actually manifesting. And it's an amazing story. So I never actually thought that I would get back to developing physical technologies, but as I say, we decided to do it for the purpose of creating some enlightenment as to the existence of some fundamentally different paradigms. And when we created FLO, it was really created as a set of training wheels. FLO is a de-stressing technology, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But as one is exposed to FLO over time, it actually is empowering, and one starts to become more and more capable of de-stressing themselves without the technology itself. So it's sort of a set of training wheels, basically. FLO technology is based upon some understanding that various of us have come to, that have spent time associated with the issue of health and illness and healing, coupled with some Russian scientific discoveries, which I'll elaborate on, and some Russian technologies that were developed over the last 2 decades. But basically, I've spent 7 years now on the scientific advisory board of a group called Friends of Health, which is an interdisciplinary group of scientists from around the world who were tasked at looking at alternative healing modalities and alternative healing phenomena and attempting to determine which of those were actually real and valid. And then further, many of us attempted to knit together the data to try to understand what the commonality was between phenomena that we saw in energy healing, healing by prayer, devices, electromagnetic devices which could create effects, and all of this kind of stuff, which seemed very, very different, but as it turns out actually have some commonalities in them. And one of the things in that journey which many of us saw were people being healed of things that in many cases are viewed to be incurable and in fact are not, clearly were not. And we came to realize, a number of us, that there is quite a fundamental relationship between stress in the broadest sense of the word and health, or also stress and dysfunction and disease. Back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, at a time when most of the Western scientific laboratories were discouraged from looking at paranormal phenomena, believing, at least in the mainstream scientific community, that all that stuff was a lot of hokum, the Soviet government, actually the Soviet Ministry of Defense, spent a considerable amount of money, and many of the best Soviet scientists and laboratories looking at various paranormal phenomena with an open mind, attempting to determine whether things like clairvoyance, telepathy, psychometry, telekinesis, remote influencing, distant healing, the reputed existence of the human aura, whether those things were real or whether they weren't. And basically, their efforts established all of those things as realities. Actually, unbeknownst to most of us in the Western world, there are actually many credible Western laboratories who have also established those things as realities. But it doesn't seem to really get through the mainstream media to the rest of us, unless you go and move in those circles. It's still widely thought that those things are bogus and, tricks and things like that. But the Soviets by the 1980s knew that all of those things were realities, and they were no longer studying the question of whether they were realities. They were studying the question of how is it possible that those things can work, given the fact that they clearly defied the classical view in physics of what's possible. So they focused on not how and not whether they worked, but how they worked, how they occurred. In my view, probably the biggest discovery of the past century has been the fundamental discovery, now proven in depth in ways that I'll describe for you, that thoughts in fact create a field. Classical science will tell you that thoughts are just an electrochemical brain phenomena and they have no physical reality of any kind other than maybe the ability to detect some kind of a weak electromagnetic signal from the brain. Actually, as it turns out, thoughts are way more than that, and thoughts do in fact create a field. There have been rumors since ancient times that there was something called the human aura that surrounded human beings and living beings, and mainstream science for many years was unable to detect it, and and reductionist scientists were unable to see it, so they thought that was a lot of hokum. That started to change when a professor emeritus at UCLA named Valerie Hunt, using a sensitive electromagnetic piece of equipment called an electromyograph, began to be able to make repeatable measurements of the layers of that field that surrounds living beings. She was very dogged in her pursuit of that because she could see those fields herself, so she knew they were real. But she was able to actually establish that she could measure some aspects of them, and where she got some electromagnetic readings, I believe that her perception was that these were weak electromagnetic fields. Actually, they're not actually electromagnetic fields, and the Soviets were the first in the 1980s to come to understand exactly what those fields really were. They came to realize that there's a fundamental new field of physics that classical physics was missing. According to classical physics, there are only 5 fields. That is, there are only 5 circumstances where you can create a distant influence on something by virtue of a field phenomenon, and those fields are well known in classical science as electric fields, magnetic fields, gravitational fields, and so-called strong and weak nuclear attraction fields. According to classical physics, that's all there are. Well, Russian physicists, particularly a physicist by the name of Akimov, and numerous others in the former Soviet Union, came to realize that there's a 6th fundamental type of field with different properties than all of the rest, and that this field is in fact literally comprised of information. That is, it doesn't actually have any presence in this dimension physically, but it can create effects in this dimension, and that the field itself is literally comprised of information. Well, trying to wrap your mind around a field that is made of information is a little difficult, but said differently, in the case of the human aura, it's essentially a field of thought forms or ideas, or as I said differently, information. But it's a non-physical field, but don't think for a minute that that doesn't have any significance in this dimension. Turns out the Russians discovered that it has huge significance in this dimension. First of all, they were the first to understand in detail what the nature of those fields was, and that those fields in fact had a non-local property attached to them. That is, unlike all other fields which follow the so-called inverse square law, where they're getting weaker as you move away from the source by the square of the distance, in the case of information fields, the Soviets found that if you knew how to do it, you could put information into the universe anywhere in the universe and take it out virtually instantaneously anywhere else. That is, these fields had a non-local property. They were not something that you could only consider only existed in one locality. Secondly, they had a property very different from electric and magnetic fields where opposites attract, where in information fields like attracts like, the opposite property, where like aspects will attract each other. And they demonstrated that by a variety of experiments in physics, including projecting an information field on laser beams, for example, such that you spin polarize the light in the laser beam similarly by virtue of both being hit with the same information field and noticing that the beams would actually bend toward each other, or if they were oppositely polarized, that they would diverge. The Soviets also found that these fields had a unique property in that they could condition space. That is, the longer you projected an information field into a given physical locality, the more that locality would literally take on the characteristic of that particular type of information field, that the space became conditioned. Excuse me. Additionally, they discovered that these fields had something called torsional properties. That is, they had sort of a right-handedness and a left-handedness to them. They also found that these fields, even though they did not themselves exist in this dimension and were non-physical, that they can in fact create effects on both energy and matter. They could cause changes in the properties of energy or energy beams or various forms of energy. By projecting information fields on some energy manifestation. They could even cause the physical manifestation of energy altogether in this dimension or cause its demanifestation in this dimension, which was really what was happening when Valerie Hunt was measuring these layers in the human aura. She was measuring electromagnetic effects, but what she was measuring was an electromagnetic effect that was being created by that field. It wasn't what the field was, it's just that the field could in fact cause the manifestation of electromagnetic effects. Similarly, these fields could cause effects in changing the properties of matter, that you could literally change the physical properties of matter by projecting information fields under certain circumstances. It turns out that not only does consciousness create an information field, and the consciousness of every living being create an information field that surrounds its physical presence, but there are other ways which the Soviets discovered could also create information fields, which were of the same nature and character, but being created via physical means. For example, there are certain geometries which will, as a matter of fact, any geometry will in fact, by virtue of its existence as a geometry, create an information field associated with that geometry. Now, there are certain classes of geometry which in ancient times were, were known and have become described in modern times as, quote, sacred geometries, that it turns out when you create those geometries, out of anything, it doesn't matter whether it's paper, metal, wood, etc. The very act of creating that geometry will in fact create the establishment of an information field. Well, as I've told you, any object will create an information field by virtue of its geometry, but the difference with a sacred geometry, so to speak, the so-called sacred geometries, which include all the Platonic solids, for example, among other things, is that when you create those geometries, they not only create an information field, they create one that has a property called coherence, and we'll come back to that in a while. It turns out that any rotating body will in fact create the existence of an information field. Any vibrating body will create the existence of an information field. Any changing magnetic field will create an informational field component. And all electromagnetic signals will, by virtue of their oscillation, as frequency oscillations, create an information field as well. So there are quite a few ways in which information fields are created in the world. There are numerous examples of naturally generated information fields, such as the sun, in fact, in the solar system, is the largest it's the most intensive generator of an information field in the solar system. Not too surprising, since I've told you certain geometries, which include spheres, will create information fields. Rotation will create them, and the sun rotates. Electromagnetic energy will create them, and the sun is, of course, a huge producer of electromagnetic energy, et cetera, et cetera. The moon also creates information fields. Trees and plants all create information fields. Human beings, animals, all living beings do. Insect nests, by virtue of their geometries, turn out to create information fields. And there are geological information fields that occur by virtue of circulation of magma in the earth. There are so-called geopathic information fields that are will be perceived as being disharmonious, that are being created by so-called geopathic stress in the Earth. Actually, there are a number of anomalous places. Some of you may have visited them where they're tourist attractions, where they've noticed gravitational anomalies and what they regard as optical illusions, which in fact turn out to be more than that, where you can have, for example, two people stand in different positions that are of the same height. One will look taller and the other will look shorter, and you reverse them, and now, the opposite is true. Interestingly, if you study those places, there's one in Oregon, there's one in California, there's one in North Carolina, you'll find that animals will refuse to go in those places. You won't find any animals other than man who pays to go in those places, going in those areas of geopathic stress. This is a synthetic, a device developed originally by the Russians, one form of it. You're looking at the inside of an information field generator that can synthetically generate information fields. Kind of a strange looking device. The Soviets, as I say, were the first to understand these fields in a great deal of depth, in this whole area of science in a great deal of depth. And literally spent 500 million rubles of the Ministry of Defense of the former Soviet Union in pursuit of the science and technologies surrounding this area of study. Initially, obviously, focused on military applications. They developed communication technologies which are faster than the speed of light and are not line of sight limited. For example, you could literally communicate with something that was behind the sun, whereas with any kind of radio technology, you would be limited by both the speed of light, and you couldn't communicate with it until it came out from being screened by the sun. Not so with information field technology. They developed satellite-based prospecting technology, where using satellite images that detected the information fields of ore deposits, petroleum deposits, things like that in the earth, and then processing those images using their knowledge of information field technology, they could tell you essentially where any kind of ore deposit or petroleum deposit was on the face of the earth via satellite prospecting. They didn't have to go dig it up, which is quite an amazing piece of technology. They developed materials processing technologies where they could change the properties of materials, change, for example, the corrosion resistance of metals, change the toughness and strength of metals, change the crystallographic structure of materials by virtue of information field technology utilized during the processing of those materials. So these were not just academic exercises. These were real technologies that had very, very powerful implications. The first piece of technology developed by in the former Soviet Union for imaging in some way the so-called human aura, or the information field that surrounds living beings, was discovered by a husband and wife team named Kirlian, in which they found that using contact photography that they could take a photographic plate and, for example, put a freshly picked leaf on it, or put your hand on it, or something like that, in an electric field, and the interaction between the information field surrounding the living object and the electric field would actually cause them to be able to photograph that field in a contact print. And there's a fairly famous photograph, for example, of a freshly picked leaf, where they did that and they photographed the field around the leaf, and then they took the leaf, cut it in half, photographed it again, and now you see again the photograph of the leaf itself and the field around it, but you see the complete field as though it were around the whole leaf, even though only half the leaf is there, which is quite interesting, that the information field surrounding the leaf still survived the destruction, physical destruction of half the leaf in the beginning. What you're looking at here on the screen is actually the computer output on the right-hand side of the screen, upper three images, of the information field surrounding a living being, which is being detected via a device called a GDV, which was developed by Dr. Konstantin Korotkov in the 1990s. And what this used was the phenomenon of Kirlian photography, but not using actually a photographic process, but using a glow discharge detector in which you would put your fingers adjacent to the detector, which is why you see these 10 fingerprints there, the aura around the person's fingerprints, and using a computer algorithm and the fact that the human aura turns out to be holographic, they could then project what the human aura looked like around the entire being. And what you're looking at in the upper series of 3 pictures of the aura surrounding a person is the person in one mental state, and then in the lower picture, you're looking at the person having intentionally changed his mental state, and you're looking at the changes in the person's aura. That this aura really is a field of thought forms. Now, frankly, for the average person to make such a change in their aura would not be possible. Most people can't make such an extreme change, but this man was a trained, what's called a Qigong master, who was expert in the area of what is called energy healing. I've taught for centuries secretly in China and only recently being started to be taught publicly. And so this man has an enormous ability to literally change his field and control all of his physical and mental processes. But anyway, it's a real example of the fact that that aura is in fact a product of consciousness. The Soviets, as I say, were the first to really understand the nature of the aura, which now the National Institute of Health in this country calls the human biofield. The field is literally comprised of information. There's nothing physical in it. And the information is being instantaneously and continuously generated by the consciousness of the individual. The primary inputs to that field come from the person's rational or waking consciousness and their subconscious. It turns out the most important elements come from the person's subconscious because those tend to go into that field and stay there on an extended basis, whereas the inputs from the waking or rational consciousness tend to be transients and they tend to come and go. People who can see the human aura, and as it turns out, any of you who can't see it may be interested to know you can be trained to see it, and there are techniques for learning to see it. Anyone who can see it will tell you that if a person becomes angry, that they can see flashes of vitiated red in the person's field. They'll perceive the field as colors, even though, as I say, it doesn't have any existence in this dimension and it isn't physically constituted of light in this dimension, but they'll perceive it that way. If they're lying to you, they'll see sort of a muddy green come into their aura, and so obviously it has some advantage to be able to see somebody's aura because you can tell a lot about what's going on in their consciousness. It turns out that this field is in fact extremely important in the fact that it is the medium of communication between the person's consciousness and literally every cell in their body. And this turns out to explain a lot, which was, even in recent times, is still unexplained in biological science as to, in fact, how cells know to become what they become. That is, we all start off our physical presence as a single cell enterprise, which then, of course, as we all know, divides and differentiates and becomes hair, blood, bones, etc., and we physically grow our physical bodies. But still today, cellular biologists cannot explain to you how your physical body gets here. How do those cells know to become an eyelid instead of an eyelash or a fingernail instead of a fingerprint? How do they know when to stop one thing and become another and all of that? And for a while, people used to, wave their arms saying, oh, well, it's genetics or DNA or whatever. And they the more that people learn, the more difficult it was to explain, because the genetics and DNA are the same in every cell. So that doesn't explain cellular differentiation. Well, it turns out that where the knowledge comes from to direct those cells is something that you come into this dimension with and exists in your consciousness. And for those of you who have been taught, as all of us have been taught, that consciousness is a product of the brain, I have to tell you there's a considerable body of science today that will tell you consciousness is not a product of the brain, it's the other way around. The brain is a product of consciousness. And while it is true that if you see brain activity, that something is going on in consciousness, the reverse is not true, that if you don't see brain activity, that nothing is going on in consciousness. And that turns out not to be true. So anyway, all of us actually have, at a certain level of consciousness, the knowledge by which we literally direct the whole orchestra of every cell in our bodies to literally create our physical body. So that's the whole phenomenon of how cells differentiate begins to be explained for the first time by the understanding of information fields as being the medium by which you literally can communicate continuously with all those cells in your body. Additionally, a big mystery in biological science has been the question of, well, why do people age? How is it that people age? Because as cellular biologists have come to understand more and more, this has become a bigger and bigger puzzle. When I was a child, they taught you that, well, things wear out, things, of course, everything wears out physically, your body wears out physically. But now that we know today that there virtually isn't a cell in your body that's older than 7 years, and most of them aren't older than a year, what part of you is old? It turns out that the answer to that question isn't the cells. The cells are always dying off and dividing and regenerating and all of that. The part of you that becomes old is actually your identity that's carried in your consciousness. And this is communicated through this field to the cells, who just dutifully create a physical reality that matches your own worldview of yourself. It turns out that information fields can interact with consciousness. The Soviets did a lot of work in the phenomenon of remote influencing, and in fact there are numerous governments in existence today that use those phenomena and literally try to gain advantage for themselves by remotely influencing people using aspects of consciousness. Remote healing is a phenomenon that owes its existence to the fact that information fields can interact with consciousness. The accumulation of stress is another phenomenon that can occur as a result of the interaction of information fields with people's consciousness. And the degree to which information fields can affect people's consciousness tends to depend upon their belief systems. Having spent, as I say, 7 years on the Science Advisory Committee of Friends of Health, I have, as many others have on that committee, been exposed to a lot of phenomena in healing and in understanding aspects of illness. And a key observation that I would make for you based upon everything that I've seen is that it appears that all beings in an unstressed state have an absolutely phenomenal ability to self-heal. Absolutely phenomenal. And it's virtually limitless. If they're alive, potentially they can self-heal, if they're in an unstressed state. Unfortunately, it turns out that as we accumulate stress in the broadest sense of the word through the process of living, that capacity starts to degenerate. Now, when I'm talking about stress, I'm not really talking about just job pressure or peer pressure or something like that. I'm talking about something that's way broader than that. I'm interpreting that word as broadly as you could possibly imagine, meaning essentially stress is any negative experience that a person has ever been exposed to in their history that they did not, in fact, discharge, heal, let go of, but in fact adopted as part of their identity. That they became the person who had thus and such a negative experience that affected them in thus and such a negative way. They were not able to process it and discharge it, and they more or less just put it on the shelf somewhere, not understanding that when they put it on the shelf, it became part of their identity. Similarly, negative ideas and limiting thoughts about ourselves that we're ever exposed to that we adopt as part of our belief systems become a certain form of stress and become essentially a corruption of our identity that's then carried forward within our consciousness. This has a lot of implications. Stresses, it's well known nowadays that there's a relationship between stress and illness. The breadth of that relationship is not very popularly understood, but it is understood that it's broad. The American Institute of Stress, for example, will tell you that 70% of all primary physician visits in the United States are for illnesses related to stress. I would tell you that it's actually 100%, because I'm defining stress somewhat broader than they are. Examples of stresses which cause illness, not surprisingly, are things like fear, hatred, anger, sadness, frustration, etc. It turns out that when it comes to aspects of human consciousness, there are 4 levels of consciousness associated with a human being. There's a level of consciousness associated with the cellular level, which has been proven and reproven time and again in the scientific community by taking cells, living cells from a donor, separating them from the donor, instrumenting them with very sensitive electromagnetic resistance measuring equipment, and then stimulating the donor while those cells are still alive, stimulating the donor either emotionally or physically, and the cells will turn out to react instantaneously. And it doesn't matter whether they're 2 feet away or 1,000 miles away. If the donor is still alive and the cells are still alive, they will react. Now that was very much of a strange occurrence relative to any understanding in physics as to how that could possibly be the case until the advent of the understanding of information fields and the non-local property of information fields. As I indicated earlier, the Soviets found that if you knew how to do it, you could input information anywhere in the universe and take it out anywhere else instantaneously. Now, the knew how to do it actually turns out to relate to something called addressing methodology. You have to have an addressing methodology. In the case of a human being and their own cells, they've got an addressing methodology. They directed the creation of those cells in the subdivision, differentiation, etc. So they know the address from an information field point of view of those cells, and therefore the issue of separating them from them is no problem with regard to still communicating with them. There's a second level of consciousness which we all are very familiar with, which some people would call rational consciousness or waking consciousness, which we're using as the primary means of communication at the moment, well known. There's another level which probably all of us are aware of to some degree, which is the so-called subconscious, which is keeping your heart beating as I'm standing here talking to you, or choosing what muscles I'm using to wave my arms without my having to figure it out, so to speak. It turns out the subconscious is doing a whole lot more than that, and as I told you before, it's the most important contributor to creating this field of information that surrounds our physical body, and is in fact the orchestrator of the information that's really driving and directing the cellular activity of the body to create our physical presence. There's a fourth level of consciousness which most people have very few transactions with, many people are completely unaware of altogether, which some people call the superconscious. Now the existence of that level of consciousness is now actually quite well established scientifically. For reasons of time at the moment, I won't go into the details of aspects of how we know that the superconscious is there and all of that, but I could bore you for hours on that subject though, I promise you. But the superconscious tends to be a level of consciousness, is a level of consciousness, which every living being has, which as it turns out is omniscient. Literally at that level of your consciousness, you literally know every fact in the universe. And most people would marvel at that and say, well, how is that possible that my consciousness at some level would know everything in the universe? What I'll tell you is that at the lower levels of consciousness, we all perceive ourselves to be separate and alone. At the highest level of consciousness, we all understand a different fundamental truth, that everything is one thing happening, that level of consciousness is the consciousness of everything in the universe, and that's why it's omniscient, because it's one consciousness. Both the subconscious and the superconscious carry identities. Actually, our rational consciousness carries an identity as well. If we were all given a piece of paper and asked to write down on a piece of paper who we are, we'd all write something. If we could somehow get our subconscious to write down who we were, which maybe you could do that via hypnosis or something like that, effectively recording the responses, you would find that who you were at the level of the subconscious is materially different than who you think you are rationally. So there's another identity carried at that level. There's a third identity that's carried at the level of the superconscious. The identity of the living being that's carried at the subconscious is changeable over time and does change over time as a person's worldviews change and as they accumulate stress, as I've defined it in the broadest sense of the word, as they begin to accept limiting ideas about themselves, etc. Their worldview of themselves at the level of the subconscious begins to change and effectively becomes corrupted in the process of living. The identity that we all carry at the level of the superconscious, as it turns out, is changeless. It never changes. It's incorruptible. It never changes at all. And these facts actually are quite fundamental to understanding the de-stressing phenomenon behind flow. You might be wondering why I'm going so much into consciousness and all this. It actually is quite fundamental to understanding this technology that I'm about to be describing to you. What I will tell you is that the nature of disease and dysfunction is that it always, as it turns out, will have a mental cause. And many people will say, well, gee, how could that be? I mean, you know, a man walks in front of a car and a car hits him and he breaks his leg. I mean, I didn't have any mental cause. The car hit him, you know. But what I'll tell you is two things. First of all, at some level of consciousness, the person, when they walked in front of the car, knew that the car was coming. That's one thing, but we won't go there for the moment. But secondly, what I'll tell you is, if in fact, after they got hit by the car, they didn't heal all the way back to original equipment, the reason why they didn't is the accumulation of stress. The business of disease and dysfunction can be seen in a sense, a very real sense, as one level of consciousness, actually namely the subconscious, trying to get the attention of another level of consciousness, namely the rational consciousness, to deal with an issue of the corruption of identity. That is, to deal with an issue of stress that's been accumulated that isn't part of your natural state, that is causing increasing disharmony in the physical body as it's being manifested into the physical body. Now, you might wonder about this, but one of the phenomena that I think all of us are well aware of who watch the news at night or any of the drug ads on TV or in magazines or things like that is that all drug therapies have side effects. All of them. We all know that. And it's certainly well known within the pharmaceutical industry. But the interesting thing about it is now that the FDA requires the disclosure of those side effects in ads, I think most of us are quite surprised to find that the nature of the side effects is inevitably worse than what it is you're trying to treat with the drug therapy. However, there is a substantial drug industry that survives despite that, and to a large extent because of the fact that a relatively small percentage of people get a particular side effect. And therefore, most people are able to content themselves with the probability that they're not going to get that particular side effect, etc. But they will always see a side effect. The reason for the side effect is that seeing, as I say, as disease and dysfunction as being one level of consciousness, namely the subconscious, trying to get the attention of another level of consciousness by manifesting some dysfunction or disharmony, when you constrain chemically the body, or physically or chemically, not to be able to manifest that phenomenon, what happens is that level of consciousness now says, well, geez, I can't make that manifestation anymore. I guess I'll have to shout in some different means, and usually in a louder means, to get their attention. And that's what the side effect is. Someone once said that aging is the accumulation of unresolved issues. And we see substantial evidence that, in fact, that statement is exactly correct. we were taught historically that aging is a natural phenomenon, that everything goes downhill, blah, blah, blah. But the more we've come to understand about cellular biology and the fact that cells are continually dying off and regenerating and reconstructing and all of that, the more puzzling it is as to why those cells are creating an increasingly disharmonious manifestation that is showing a degeneration over time. And people once thought, well, it's because of the corruption of DNA by cosmic radiation or electromagnetic radiation or something like that. That's where aging comes from. But then they ran across diseases in which all of the person's DNA was corrupted. And yet in some of those cases, the people would amazingly then heal the DNA and overcome the disease to where the corruption of the DNA became uncorrupted. So it became apparent that DNA isn't primary, and that consciousness does have the capacity to heal even DNA. So anyway, what I will tell you is that aging is essentially a programming phenomenon where we've all accepted this idea that we have to degenerate and deteriorate, and we're all programming ourselves just by virtue of the process of living by the accumulation of stress, which manifests increasingly as dysfunction. Well, at this point, I'll finally get around to introducing you to FLO, which is this de-stressing technology that I originally told you was the subject of the meeting and for which you so graciously turned out this evening. What you see here is a person lying down in an environment which, as you can see, is not fully enclosed. They're being surrounded by an information field that is being synthetically generated. What this environment is a very highly efficient de-stressing technology. Essentially, the FLO de-stressing technology works because we are creating a very powerful and very harmonious information field, and that information field is creating a de-stressing effect. The information field is in fact derived from three elements. There's one element of the field that's being derived simply by virtue of geometry. I told you before that one of the means of creating information fields are so-called sacred geometries. We use that phenomenon to create a coherent field within FLO, such that even when this device is not plugged in, not turned on, or anything else, there is an information field in FLO. And it is a harmonious one, and it is one that has a property of coherence. There's a second and a third element, both of which are dynamic information field elements within FLO, that are being derived respectively from the information that is being taken from both music and light. I'll describe more about that in a bit. When you place an individual in a very powerful and harmonious field of information, it will tend to induce a rapid process of de-stressing. And I'll describe more about that in a minute. When you stress a person, as I've pretty elaborately made the point by now, you tend to deteriorate their physical presence over time. But the good news is that you can de-stress people. And as you do de-stress people, it tends to restore their innate self-healing capability. FLO itself is not a healing device in any way, shape, or form. It's a de-stressing environment. But when you de-stress people, as I say, you tend to restore their innate self-healing capability. Basically, what happens in FLO is a client reclines within the unit. It doesn't matter whether they're awake or asleep. They'll lie down in there, and they're in there for typically 20 minutes. What happens to create this de-stressing mechanism is that the field that's being created from the three elements that I described for you, the synthetic information field within FLO, has a property of coherence. When a person enters that field and lies down in it, their subconscious is immediately aware of the fact that they're being surrounded by an information field because it knows that it's creating one in real time. So it knows what an information field is, but it has never experienced being surrounded by a field that is both more powerful than its own and more harmonious and more coherent than its own. What happens as a result of the subconscious detecting this very harmonious and coherent information field around it, is that in an effort to understand what in the world is going on, it will connect the subconscious, individual's subconscious will connect with their superconscious. And your subconscious, I can assure you, knows that you have a level of consciousness, namely a superconscious, and it also knows that that level of consciousness is omniscient. For the most part, the subconscious normally has very few transactions with the superconscious, but in this case, in an effort to understand what's going on with this environment, it'll make that connection. When it does make that connection, now it begins to compare the identity which it's carrying of the person with the incorruptible identity carried by the superconscious. And it becomes aware of all of this corruption that it's accumulated, and it starts to let go of that corruption. It does so issue by issue. It put those issues in there issue by issue. It adopted those ideas about itself and those experiences issue by issue. It lets go of them issue by issue. And eventually, it starts to, well, as it's letting go of these issues, it's changing the information field around the person's physical being, which, as I pointed out, is the communication means, or the operating manual, if you will, or the operating instructions for every cell in their body. So as they start to jettison this baggage that we all accumulate in the process of living, they start the subconscious starts to produce a more and more harmonious information field surrounding the person's physical presence, which begins to be reflected in a more harmonious physical presence. That is, the body starts various repair mechanisms, which are natural. The priority, that is, the order of priority in which these issues are let go, is actually being given to the subconscious by the superconscious based upon the individual's spiritual and physical welfare. And that can be a little bit puzzling. You can have a person who comes in with a particular physical issue that understands all of this and says, well, my objective is to solve this particular physical issue. I've got an aching knee. For example. And it may be quite some time in terms of de-stressing processes, de-stressing efforts, before the person finally gets around to that knee problem, because as it turns out, there are other things that turned out to be more important. When people are in flow, many just perceive it to be a relaxing session that is surprisingly relaxing for the fact that they're only in there for 20 minutes. The reason why they feel de-stressed is because these issues are being let go by the subconscious. But they may not be consciously aware of what those issues are. They may be. Sometimes their waking consciousness will couple into that chain, and they'll become aware of what those issues are that are being let go. Those sessions will tend to be rather emotional ones, but they'll be quite positive ones because they'll realize that the issue is being let go. But for the most part, people let go of those issues without coupling in their waking consciousness. And their waking consciousness simply becomes aware of this sort of revitalization and renewal that's all disproportional to a 20-minute nap or just being in an environment lying down for 20 minutes. As I say, some people will report strong positive emotional experiences, and those tend to be the cases where their waking consciousness is coupling into the process, and they're aware of what's being let go in terms of this baggage that we all accumulate. There's pretty much universal feelings of stress relief and revitalization from people being in this environment. Very often, people come back and report various modes of self-healing and various self-healing occurrences which they've experienced as a result of having been in this environment. That is, as the accumulation of stress tends to be reflected in dysfunction and disharmony, the release of stress tends to restore a person's innate self-healing mechanisms, and they start to heal themselves. And this typically happens some time afterward, days, weeks, etc., after they've been in. Some report increasing abilities as a result of having been in this environment. That is, actually, as it turns out, we all have quite amazing abilities compared with what we're normally utilizing. The reason why we're not using them all is because levels of our consciousness have become disconnected from each other. But if you start to reconnect them, you find that you essentially remember those abilities and begin to manifest them. In the process of de-stressing, as I say, people commence various repair processes. Those tend to be the more difficult physical issues first, and then other ones subsequently. But eventually, they literally get around to rejuvenation. Because in fact, the whole process of aging is nothing more than the accumulation of stress. We've seen two self-healing modes reported back to us by people going through FLO. By far, the majority of them are the first of these two categories which I've described here. By far, they tend to be processes which are apparently based upon physical kinetics that were physical processes that were re-enabled by virtue of de-stressing. And as I say, those types of repair processes tend to appear days or even weeks after a person's been through the given session. Occasionally, we find people manifesting essentially instantaneous healings of a given problem. Those are rare, but there have been enough of them that we know that there is a second mechanism. And, due to time constraints, I won't elaborate on the reasons for the difference in those mechanisms, even though we believe that we do understand those reasons. So there are two modes. By far, the one that's prevalent is the one based upon processes that takes time. Examples of the new abilities reported that I alluded to are things like, for example, people finding that they can actually see information fields. They can see the human aura. People who can see the human aura, incidentally, will be able to see the field in FLO because it's exactly the same kind of field. Interestingly, little children almost inevitably can see the human aura. They tend to lose that ability by the time they're 5 to 8 years old, but when they first come into the world, they tend to be able to perceive it quite clearly. And so interestingly, when we have little children in FLO, very often they will comment on seeing these beautiful colors flowing over them, and they'll comment on the bars, the copper bars in FLO glowing and things like that, because they can actually see information fields. But we've had adults go through who didn't realize that they had ever been able to see information fields, who found that now they could see them. We've had one instance, maybe more than one, I'm trying to remember, but at least one instance where an individual, after going through, found that he could read thoughts of other people, where he had never manifested that ability before. Well, the fact of the matter is we all can do that at the level of the subconscious. It's just at the level of the waking consciousness, we're not connected with our subconscious, so we don't know we can do it. We're not consciously aware that we're doing it. But if somebody reconnects their subconscious and waking consciousness, they'll find that in fact they can do that. And again, little children coming into the world typically have their waking consciousness and subconscious connected, and they're fully telepathic in the beginning. But they give that up again by the time they're 5 to 8 years old. Some people find that they spontaneously begin downloading pieces of information that they had no way of knowing otherwise. Many cases, technical information. That's something that I personally have a great deal of experience doing, even before FLO, but much enhanced since I've been going through FLO. But numerous other people have reported the same kind of thing to me. Downloading other forms of inspiration as well, such as artistic inspiration or being able to compose music or things like that. Some people have noticed the ability to do precognition. That is, that they suddenly find an idea coming in which turns out to be something which they're seeing ahead of time and subsequently then do experience at some future date. Numerous people have noticed that after making this increasing connection with their superconscious, that they can draw into themselves energy and project it, that becomes easier to do over time. Some final observations that I would offer you are based upon what I've seen, both related to de-stressing and in other venues and with other environments and other phenomena. I don't believe there are such a thing as incurable diseases. We're all taught that there are, but I've seen many, many examples of things which people have healed, which are supposed to be incurable, and I personally believe there's no such thing. It certainly is the case that occasionally you run into individuals who are unwilling to be healed. That's a different thing. Examples would be somebody who's just grown tired of the process of life and they don't want to be here anymore. And you'll see that kind of phenomenon expressed in the fact that if they see an opportunity to be healed, they'll reject it. They won't come back. They won't use it. They, whatever. That would be one example. I've known individuals that exhibited that phenomenon. Occasionally you run into people who, by virtue of having manifested illness, are getting attention which they really needed emotionally and spiritually. And they're getting it for the first time in their lives, and they're afraid to be healed because they're afraid that they'll lose that attention which they badly need from a spiritual or emotional point of view. If they deal with the issue which caused them to need that, then in fact they won't be afraid of being healed. But you've got a chicken and egg problem there. Occasionally you'll run into individuals, and this is quite rare, but it's quite real, and I've experienced this also firsthand, where they're manifesting an illness not because they have any degree of disharmony within themselves or anything like that. And they're usually individuals with very high vibrations who are trying to catalyze change in others by virtue of manifesting an illness. Those you will only be able to heal by virtue of fulfilling the mission for which they were manifesting that. You've all been very patient, and I thank you.